Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
What does true quality mean? How does this relate to compliance? These are really tough questions to answer sometimes if you think about it. And probably no secret to any of you listening that I'm a huge fan of the program from FDA, CDRH, Case for Quality. And I'm really thrilled to have my guest on this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast, Zack. George is with Two Harbors Consulting, and a big part of the medical device discovery appraisal program being conducted by the CMMI Institute on behalf of Case for Quality. So be sure to take a listen to this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host, the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight, Guru John Spear. And really excited for this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. A few weeks ago, I had a chance to meet Zack. George is with Two Harbors Consulting, and really excited because of a lot of the things that George is involved with and really, this whole Case for Quality initiative. And we'll dive into that a little bit here in a moment. But George, welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast.
Hey, good morning, John. Really happy to be here. I've enjoyed the podcast for quite some time. I think I shared with you that I listen to it quite often. And when you spoke up at that meeting that you came out to, I didn't recognize your face, but as soon as I heard your voice, since you've been plugged in my ears many times, I was really pleased to meet you and happy to be here this morning.
Yeah, folks, when I was at this event, it was an MDIC Case for Quality event recently, and I asked a question, and I thought it was a pretty good question. And then George had his body language shifted, and I'm like, all right, maybe that wasn't such a good question. And then I learned after the session, and I had the chance to talk with George one-on-one, that he recognized my voice. That was the reaction, but it kind of threw me off a little bit. But George, I know you've been very involved in the Case for Quality initiative. But before we dive too deep in those topics, tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about Two Harbors.
Sure. I'm a consultant. I'm part of a small consulting firm that's, as you said, called Two Harbors Consulting. And our job is we help organizations and businesses achieve better performance and quality outcomes. The team that I work with, we came out of the healthcare space a few years ago. We've actually engaged with firms in all sorts of markets, in healthcare, medical devices, software, public school systems, defense systems. Essentially, what we're doing is we're leveraging a variety of tools and standards and frameworks and regulations to help those organizations so that they can, say they're a software organization and they want to become agile. We'll help them with their agile journey. If they're a device company and they want to be more compliant to the QSR, we can help them with that. And a few ways, if they happen to be a software company that's making medical devices or a SAMD, we can help them do both. One of the frameworks that we use that I think you and I will be talking about at some point today is the Capability Maturity Model, or the CMMI. And that's one that we leverage within this program that we'll be talking about today. So yeah, essentially small consulting firm that helps companies be better. I know that sounds just kind of, like a quick phrase there, but yeah, that's our objective. We've had a lot of success with it, and we've only been around 3 years. But we've had a lot of success with it in a variety of markets, including the medical device space.
Yeah, and obviously I connected with you because of your efforts with the CMMI Institute and the appraisal model, the medical device discovery appraisal program. And I guess if you can maybe share a little bit about how the MDDAP, that one just doesn't roll off the tongue yet, I'll confess, but how that appraisal program kind of fits into the overall FDA Case for Quality initiative, and maybe talk a little bit about that, because for me it was a little confusing to try to connect the dots. But I know you've been doing this for a bit, and it might help enlighten and share how all this fits together.
Yeah. So I'll try to cover it here, but I'd also give a little bit of credit to where credit's due. Over the holidays, John, you wrote a really good and published a really good white paper on it on the Greenlight site on the overall effort related to Case for Quality, and how this program, or what I call MDAP, There's a variety of names for it, which is its own conversation unto itself. But that medical device recovery appraisal program, how that is a part of it. So I'd certainly point people to that, and they can get into a lot of the details. And you did a great job connecting the dots there.
Oh,
but
thank you.
In short, this appraisal program is a part of that case for quality. The case for quality has roots that tie back several years, where CDRH's Dr. Jeffrey Shuren noted astutely that they were compliant and having quality issues, or they were not compliant and still producing a quality product. And so he recognized that compliance was simply not enough. It wasn't to say it wasn't necessary, but it was not enough. And leveraging a public-private partnership, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, MDIC, they started to explore several programs and ways that they could assess organizations beyond just compliance to the regulation. They saw, great, you know what, we're seeing that we have CAPA, as an example, is our number one cited 483 finding year after year after year. Well, is there a different way we should be looking at organizations? And so that has spawned a variety of efforts that MDIC oversees as a part of the case for quality. MDIC being a place where industry and the agency can connect together and work on these problems. And one of those efforts was exploring how a maturity model would provide insight to the capabilities of an organization to produce quality products. So above and beyond just compliance, were there specific practices or typical practices that organizations demonstrated that would help them achieve higher quality outcomes in the products and the services that they produced? There was a few years ago, there were several maturity models reviewed, and the capability maturity model integrated, or CMMI, which had been known for 2 decades, mostly in the defense space, but it's applicable to a variety of markets. It was chosen as the model for the pilot that was run in 2018. So with that, a third-party appraisal is performed against a participating medical device manufacturing organization. That results in feedback to that organization as to how they're performing against the practice areas that are in scope for this particular program, gives them feedback as to areas in which they can improve and where they're demonstrating strong capabilities. These are organizations that have already demonstrated a strong history of compliance. So the facility itself is something that's already undergone its establishment registration. They haven't had any official action indicated over the last handful of years. By way of participating in this, in addition to getting that appraisal performed and the feedback, the facilities that participate are also eligible for some regulatory modifications, which include that they don't undergo the routine inspection. They have streamlined submissions for the review of change notices and site change submissions. We're also working through some other potential benefits between what industry wants and what the agency is able to provide. So in 2018, we had 18 organizations enroll that represented 36 facilities undergoing an appraisal, and we've had a lot of positive feedback and a lot of success. I think that's in a nutshell. We can break down into the different parts that you think that you're most interested in, John.
Yeah, so I made a couple of notes here, and we'll dive into a few of those here in a moment. But I want to kind of revisit the comment that I don't know if it's famous yet, but Dr. Shuren has come out and made the statement that compliance is not enough. I think I've even heard at one point in time, either Dr. Shuren or somebody from CDRH has made the statement that they hope to purge the term compliance from their lexicon within the next few years. And, I get the idea, the notion behind that, but let's talk a little bit more about, compliance versus quality. And I guess specifically, without, giving away any proprietary information, what has your experience been? You said that for a company to be involved in case for quality and a part of the appraisal program, that they have to basically have a clean bill of health, so to speak, when it comes to compliance. But what anecdotes or information can you share about sort of the difference between being compliance-minded and quality-minded?
Yeah, I'm going to give a non-medical device example because it seems to get people of our age, John, to understand it very quickly. Before you hit record, we were talking about the holiday break, and I mentioned that I have teenage children. And a couple of years ago, I went through that wonderful experience of bringing my children to get their driver's licenses. And that's a coming of age unto itself for both them, but I felt much more me. And I really recognized that, particularly the day my son got his driver's license, that he was a compliant driver. He had demonstrated by going and getting his driver's license.
Yeah.
And holding his hands on the wheel at 10-2, and even doing that thing where you reach up and you touch the rearview mirror, so that the person who's proctoring the driver's test is like, oh yeah, they're looking at their mirror. He was a compliant driver. Now, was he a quality driver? Certainly not. And so. And I think he thought he was a quality driver, but it's going to take time and experience for him to get to that. He's better now, so thankfully. And I think similarly, it's very easy for organizations. And you're right; it was Dr. Shern who made that statement about the compliance being dropped from the lexicon in the device field. We don't necessarily think of, when we get on an airplane, of just being in compliance, right? We're also looking for a quality experience as a part of our flight. And the same thing in the device space. I think that we're not just looking for devices that are compliant, but we're going to, as consumers of those devices, or having family members that are consumers of those devices, we're looking for ones that are going to be safe and effective. But I know those are the terms that are thrown out the most often. But are they also readily available? Is that value stream through that particular business bringing those devices to market in a fashion where they're accessible to me? And so one of the things that we're doing in the appraisal is across the practice areas, we're looking more holistically than just at compliance. We're not just saying, hey, drum out your DHF so that we can look at how you've tied your inputs to your outputs and design controls. But we're also looking at how the organization has estimated and planned that work and how they're responding to incidents. So it's in many areas, there's probably, in looking at the appraisal, there's probably many things that you would look at and you'd say, oh yeah, when I look at that practice area within the CMMI, that sounds a lot like 820 dot whatever. But there's other things that are broader than that. And in addition to it just being compliance, we're also working with the organizations to identify areas in which they can really improve so that they can better those quality outcomes. So I'm not certain I directly answered your question there. No. Maybe with the driving example, but maybe not necessarily an example from.
But I can relate. I can relate to the driving example as a father of two teenagers who are both drivers. I chuckled a little bit as you talked about being compliant. My children went through similar experiences, and I'm still waiting for their quality to improve. But but that being said, I mean, you talked about some practice areas. I don't want to delve into that a little bit because on the surface, when I first learned about the appraisal program and these practice areas, to me, it kind of sounded like, oh, this is like an audit, but like a different flavor. What do you think? I mean, is this like an audit? I mean, how is it different from an audit? How is it the same?
Yeah, so there certainly are elements that are similar in that there's when I perform both, right? I have performed for other businesses. They've actually hired me, or they've hired Two Harbors, and we all know we've hired consultants out there to play the auditor. And sometimes they even say, hey, we want you to come in and play the tough guy auditor, really ask us the really hard questions. And so you're going in, and what's similar is that there's a framework. When you do an audit, maybe that's 820 or 803 or 806 and 807 or 1345, whatever it is. And you are asking questions to understand how they are meeting the intent of those regulations. In a similar regard, in assessment, where we are certainly asking questions to understand how they're meeting the intent of the practices that we're looking at within the CMMI appraisal, the areas that we've scoped with the MDIC and the agency and the industry partners that are in there. But I would say that's essentially where a lot of the similarities end, and that there's a lot of things that are very different. Now, I'll give you a couple, but I'll also suggest, John, that people hearing it from me as a consultant, they might say, okay, whatever. We've also, with MDIC, we've had a few webinars where we've had participants come back and speak to how they perceive the difference from an assessment and a CMMI assessment to be very different than a typical audit from the FDA. And so I think their words are going to be much more golden, if you will. So go back. I can share the links with you, and I'd say go back and listen to those things where you can hear it from big industry partners as to how they perceive it's different. But essentially, where I would say it is, since we're moving from just a compliance, like how did you meet the intent of the regulation? And we're asking more broadly, how can you continuously improve and how can you achieve higher levels of quality outcomes? That shifts the entire tone. And frankly, it takes some time for the participating businesses to get that. We're speaking directly with people that are performing the work. We're asking for an open dialogue. That's very different. We're all familiar with that when we train people to go through audits or inspections. If you're asked, do you know what time it is? Your answer is yes. You don't give the time in an audit or inspection. And so in an assessment, we're actually working to get people to go beyond that and to speak to us as to how the work's actually being performed, maybe even beyond what's actually written or not written in their procedures. So we're moving beyond just looking at documents. We don't start with document review. We might use that to support our activities, but we're really talking to the people and doing that in a way that's very open and transparent so that we can learn how to improve the organization. This changes a lot of things. Then you'll see that the back room is not necessary. The typical audit back room that might be staffed by tens or maybe even in some cases dozens and dozens of people. Prep is not necessary. We've had organizations ask us, "Hey, how can we prep for this? And what is it that we need ahead of time to study for?" And we say that just no, don't prep and study. Instead, tell us how you actually do the work. And other things that are different, as an example, is as we work with an organization over the week, we come back and we say, okay, these are the things that we've heard. These are your appraisal results. Is this right? Because we want you to be able to own this set of results, not fight them and say, oh, that's not really a finding, but that you can look at that and say, yeah, that's an area of that improvement. That's something we need to work on. That's a value add to us. And when this appraisal team is gone, we can understand it. And that's obviously very significantly different than what you get in a 483 or a warning letter as the result of an inspection. So there are a lot of areas that are different. Those are a couple. And I'd also suggest that people go back and check out what they can hear from industry colleagues if they're interested as to some of the things that they perceive as different.
Yeah, well, and folks, we'll get those links and share them with the text that accompanies the podcast. So that you can hear from yourself. But, a couple of thoughts there. I mean, as I'm sure maybe many of those listening, we've been a part of audits, I've been in this industry for over 20 years now, and being, quote, audit ready is something that, you always, especially those in the quality area, try to make sure that their companies are prepared for it. And it's almost become, I would say, in my experience, that we as an industry, it's like we've been conditioned to be compliance minded. And I think that, if I were to analyze some of the comments that I've heard from Dr. Sharon, Cisco Vicente, and some of the case for quality messaging, it's almost like there's a reprogramming effort underway. And I know you've been a part of that with the appraisal program. So I think, one could say, well, how did we get here? Well, I think it has been because we've been so focused on, did we meet the regulation? And we start to structure our processes and procedures in a way that demonstrates that compliance, that sometimes we've lost the bigger picture. I mean, we are in the medical device industry. We are helping save and improve the quality of life. So for me, this program has been extremely refreshing because, just to dive into some of the comments that you made, it's really about understanding how the business operates, and I guess, you've done probably dozens and dozens of appraisals by now, both within and outside the med device industry. So I guess maybe share a moment where there was a light bulb or something, an epiphany that happened with one of the companies where you did the appraisal, how they suddenly saw that, oh, wow, this is a different context.
Sure. The CMMI practices that we're looking at are not, they're not necessarily specific to the medical device industry. They are applicable to all industries. Even in my own consulting firm, we periodically go back and we'll look at the CMMI model and say, okay, are we doing these particular practices? So,
and I'm sorry, just wanted to chime in. So you've mentioned practice areas a couple of times. Maybe if you could give a couple of examples of a few practice areas, that way people could kind of wrap their head around.
Right. So, that's a classic one is, so there are, in this program, there are 11 in scope, 7 practice areas in scope. And within those 11 practice areas, and those are things like technical solution and product integration and configuration management and planning and monitoring control. There's others that are out of scope for this particular program at this time, but for initial appraisals, but they would be brought in as the participating organization sees appropriate and a value add to them. So that could be things like incident resolution and prevention, supplier agreement management. A classic one that organizations, no surprise here, I'll give you 2 that they often struggle with, not just in the medical device industry, but more broadly, is requirements development and management and configuration management. So I know from a configuration management perspective, we've all dealt with that spreadsheet or that document or that project plan or that SOW, whatever it is, that ends up getting emailed around, and then you're making edits to it, I'm making edits to it. It's on somebody's desktop, and it's not necessarily controlled. Now, maybe from a medical device perspective, that's not that type of document's not necessarily needing to be controlled, but how you manage the things that need to be under appropriate levels of configuration management can have an impact to your business. Requirements development, right? So often you'll see organizations, particularly young organizations, struggling with how do we collect in requirements? How do we manage our particular queue of those things? Are those stories? Are those features? Is that an SRS? Are we taking that in from our complaint queue as well? How do we consider that from a risk perspective? And the model itself represents a set of practices that gives you an organized way to consider how to, at a very simple level, hey, let's record our requirements. And then as you get to higher levels of capability and maturity, how are you considering those requirements by involving all the necessary stakeholders? How are you considering your requirements with your supplier? How are you considering that with other systems that you might need to, those requirements with other systems that you need to interface with? How are you going to validate those particular requirements? So the light bulb goes on for organizations when typically by going through an appraisal. I make the analogy that going through an appraisal itself it doesn't necessarily create the process improvement, but it's like going to a doctor and then they're saying to you, this is the state of your health. This is what your BP is. This is what your BMI is. This is your blood, the blood markers levels that you have. And then from there, you can start to identify what's the appropriate plan for that patient or for that organization as to how they can improve on those particular things. And there certainly are some commonalities. I mentioned requirements management there and configuration management, but all the organizations have their own sets of struggles. Maybe it's in how they size their particular efforts in terms of cost and effort, or how they deal with incidents, or how they're coming up with designs. While there's commonality across the areas of the practices in the framework, each organization has its own unique profile in terms of their capabilities. Does that help, John?
Yeah, that helps a great deal. And folks, I just want to remind you, I'm talking with Zack. George is with Two Harbors Consulting, and George has been very involved with the Medical Device Appraisal Program, or MDDAP program, which is a part of the Case for Quality initiative. And just as George is talking, one of the things that I want to remind all of you as well, that we at Greenlight Guru, we've built an EQMS software platform specific for the medical device industry. And our mantra is about true quality, and when I learned about the MDAP and Case for Quality initiatives, it was like, for me, a light bulb went off, because it's like, yes, finally there is an awareness or an initiative that's out there to help companies shift from just being compliance minded and really start to focus on managing their business in a way that results in the safest, most effective medical devices possible. So I encourage you to check out George and Two Harbors Consulting. You can go to their website at www.twoharborsconsulting.com. Or actually, let me back up. I think it's even simpler than that. I think it's 2hc.com. You can go and learn more about Two Harbors Consulting. And of course, you can learn more about the Greenlight Guru EQMS software platform by going to www.greenlight.guru. So, George, you talked about the companies who participate in the pilot program. And I guess first, the pilot program, it's my understanding, it is continuing throughout 2019, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right. So I know like the
current news cycle, I think we're all, on the day you're recording this, we're all trying to figure out what's going on with the FDA with the current news cycle. But yes, it is doing in 2019.
Yeah. And as we're recording this too, I believe the government is still on shutdown. So obviously FDA is part of the government. So, there's trying to figure out if, what, when, and all that sort of thing. Hopefully there's little impact to progressing through this program in 2019. But some of the things you talked about, the regulatory benefits to participants in the pilot program in 2018, and I know a lot of those regulatory benefits. I mean, the obvious most obvious of those was not needing or having to go through an FDA inspection as long as they're involved in the program. But there were some other regulatory benefits, predominantly for like PMA Class 3 devices, advanced review times and cycle times and things like that. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on some of those regulatory benefits for the 2018 participants?
Yeah, sure. So the most basic that you mentioned is that routine inspection. So the inspection that I think that people are expecting, where the FDA comes and knocks on your door and asks for a cup of coffee and a walk through your facility, and then maybe wants to camp out for a few days to go through documentation and talk to people. That routine inspection activity gets waived. And for some people, that alone is a benefit enough. Now, certainly for organizations that are participating in MDSAP, they may say that that's not really something that is of great value to them, but to organizations that can often get tied up with an inspection that can tie them up in that back room and maybe impact production significantly for days or maybe even a week or more. We've had different numbers on that. We've had some organizations say, hey, we value the removal of that at a $10,000 benefit. And we've had other organizations tell us that they value it at a $500,000 benefit because of the lack of interruption.
Wow. Hang on, I just want to pause there because that's pretty significant, whether it's $10,000 or $500,000. I've been in those, even for small companies going through an FDA inspection. I mean, you're probably tying up at least 2, maybe 3 FTEs for a solid week, and then if, you don't have that kind of interruption that an inspection tends to bring, I mean, that could be pretty significant. So right. Go ahead.
Right. And one of the MDIC case for quality forms, a leader from one of the large medical device manufacturers showed a picture of the back room that they had for their MDSAP inspection, and it was manned by close to 50 people.
Holy cow.
So you can do whatever you want from a run rate on that for those people across the course of that 5 days and what the cost of that would be. And again, and then she did a comparison of that to, there was nobody essentially in the back room for the CMMI appraisal activity because we strive for it to be as non-interruptive. Obviously we're taking up time for people to do the planning of that. There's going to be people in interviews, but to be much less interrupt driven. So there's certainly benefit with that. Another one is the 30-day change notice. And this one's what's really interesting to me about this is initially I thought that this would be, the benefit would be, okay, we have an engineering change. If we can implement that more quickly and the FDA streamlines that from 30 days down to 5 days or 2 days, hey, we're getting that change in faster. And particularly if we're running different production lines, say for the US versus Europe, we can now implement those changes at the same time. And that's really where our benefit would be. One of the things that we're hearing from organizations is that with such a streamlined process, your engineers, your problem solvers are more likely to bring problems or engineering changes that would be a benefit to the organization to the table, where in the past they may not, because they'd say, there's all this submission paperwork. It's too much. I'm not going to even bother trying with that.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. So let me elaborate on that. Just let me elaborate on that for some folks. So in the US, if you have a class 3 PMA device and you identify that you need to make a change, it is not a trivial exercise as it stands in a traditional model. There's a change notification process that you need to engage FDA on making that change. And so what George is pointing out is that in a lot of organizations, because of these hurdles, we'll say, perceived or real, but hurdles that are in place for making changes. A lot of times the changes wouldn't happen. They would go into the queue and maybe never to see the light of the day. But what George has observed is that, wow, with this appraisal program, that now engineers are more likely to bring these changes to the surface, which, that to me, all by itself is pretty profound, because you want to talk about the reason that I'm an engineer, I solve problems. The reason I would make a change is to make an improvement to something. And if I'm bearing the opportunity for improvement because of the regulatory hurdles that I have to go through, then no kidding, no wonder my device isn't as safe and effective as it could possibly be. So this is a wonderful discovery.
Yeah, we're really excited about that. I think initially the feedback that we were hearing was that with a stream, you can certainly do the math to say, hey, something that was taking me 30 days, here's the cost associated with that, and here's the cost savings that's associated with that. If it's taking 5, I can implement those changes faster. But just, I don't even know how to put a number on the value of, like, now we're going to bring more.
Yeah.
You don't have a case for that to say, now we're bringing more ideas to bear. Additionally, one of the things that came out is there was a large medical device manufacturer that did some analysis, and with the number of changes that they were submitting to the FDA separately, they were essentially tying up the equivalent of an FTE at the FDA with the number of changes that they were submitting in a year. There wasn't just one person sitting there, waiting for the changes.
Right.
George Zack Medical Devices, but essentially it added up to that. And so with a streamlined approach where they can also combine multiple changes in this streamlined approach, the FDA is also saying, hey, look, we don't need to, they're seeing benefit. Perhaps the listening audience is less concerned about FDA benefits, but they're seeing benefit, and they're saying, hey, look, we don't have to tie up resources in that same way with this streamlined approach. So they're improving and learning, and they're able to reallocate those resources to other activities to bring other devices to the market more quickly, or to inspect firms that maybe are not necessarily in compliance. So they're looking at some benefits as well.
Well, that's important. I mean, we're in an ecosystem for sure, and so FDA is, one way of looking at it could be a customer of ours as a medical device company, but they certainly hold some decision-making power in that process too. So, we have to be cognizant of not only the resources in our organizations, but also those third-party regulatory agencies. That's pretty significant, but I guess for those listening and you kind of putting a wrapper on this podcast, it sounds like a lot of the benefits in the 2018 were, I'll say, skewed more toward class 3 PMA type device companies. And what do you see coming in 2019? Is this going to be more geared towards, companies of all shapes and sizes, all device types, or is there a certain type of company, a certain device type that you see being more beneficial in the 2019 version of the pilot?
Yeah. So before I answer where I think some of the regulatory benefits are coming in 2019, the size of the company, we've had the biggest of the bigs, all the big names that you're familiar with in this program. We've also had a handful of small organizations. I think the smallest organization that we've had participate in this pilot was 17 people, a software development shop that had 17 total staff in it, and privately held, not publicly traded. So the program itself at this point is it's not just for large organizations. We dealt with small, medium, and large class 1, class 2, and class 3 organizations. To your point about where the benefits are going, it's very much a hot topic within the working groups that we have as a part of this program. So in addition to the organizations participating that get an appraisal, we are also asking those organizations to come back and help us improve this program. And one of those is, what are the regulatory benefits that would make the most sense for you? And it's probably no big surprise. Everybody's looking for something streamlined in the 510K space, and that seems to be very much aligned with what we're hearing out of the agency in terms of how they're trying to shift their thinking on predicate devices and the age of predicate devices, and where they're going with their safety action plan. And one of the working groups that we have formed with our participants and the agency is to get the right representation from industry and the agency in a virtual room and discuss through what that looks like. So right now, I would say that's probably the hottest ticket, particularly in the Class 2 space. And we're really hopeful that by way of those conversations, we can define something that would be helpful in that space. I think it's also aligned with what I would expect is it's outside the case for quality, but I know that you've also spoke on this podcast about the digital health pre-certification program. I know that those software as medical device manufacturers are really interested in benefits in that space. It would seem to me that while there will be some SAMD devices that may bubble up to a Class 3, it seems to me like a lot of them would be in the Class 2 space. I feel that whatever's defined in this program is probably also going to have some spillover into that program from the 510K space as well. So I think that's an area this program's driving towards that, but there's also other initiatives that are all driving us towards some sort of shift or modification or whatever you want to call it in the 510K space.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. And folks, George and I are just really skimming the surface of the MDAP program, the Medical Device Discovery Appraisal program, and would encourage you all to learn more about George, Zack, and Two Harbors Consulting to twhc.com. And of course, we'll provide additional supporting information about MDIC, the CMMI Institute, and the appraisal program. Because in my opinion, it doesn't matter your shape or size of your organization, understanding how your business functions and operates and getting into this mindset of continuous opportunity for improvement is really the right way to go. And I've had some candid conversations with George about ways to implement the appraisal methodology within our business here at Greenlight Guru. And I think it's really a great mindset, especially for those of us in the medical device industry, because remember, we are improving the quality of life with the devices and that we're developing and manufacturing. So, to enable changes, to enable opportunities for improvement is something that we should all be mindful of and something that we should, try to enable within our particular organizations. So, George, thank you so much for being my guest on the Global Medical Device Podcast.
Thank you, John. Again, really honored. And like I said, I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast in the past. I probably won't listen to this one because it'll be like listening to fingernails on the chalkboard with my voice. But the work that you guys are doing here in this podcast, I think, is leading in terms of sharing this information as to how this space is changing, and it's a really interesting time. So, thanks again for the opportunity to speak, and be happy to speak with you at any point in the future about where the program's going.
Oh, my pleasure. Folks, once again, George Zack with Two Harbors Consulting, and you've been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast.